She walked through the restaurant doors already scanning the room for him, and the first thing she saw stopped her mid-step: a wheelchair. A man sitting in it, hands folded in his lap, waiting at a table by the window. April's heels slowed against the marble floor. For half a second, something in her chest tightened, not disgust, not pity exactly, something harder to name. A recalibration. The date she'd pictured in her head, walking there, wasn't the date sitting in front of her now. He looked up. Their eyes met across the room, and whatever he saw in her face in that first second, he was watching for it. Carefully. Like a man checking the temperature of water before deciding whether to step in, she kept walking, not because she'd decided anything grand, just because stopping would have meant something she didn't want it to mean. April. His voice was low, even better composed than she expected from a man his age. And you're late explaining who set me up with a stranger. She sat down across from him. But I'll allow it since you already look nervous enough. That got a real laugh out of him, surprised, like he hadn't planned on laughing tonight. Hanyi. He extended a hand toward her, unhurried. And for the record, I told Renee this was a terrible idea. She didn't tell you I already agreed it was a terrible idea before I got here. She left that part out. April unfolded her napkin, glanced at him once, not at the chair, at him, and let the silence sit a beat before she spoke again. So, are we going to talk about the elephant, or are we going to order first? Hanyi's expression shifted just slightly, like he hadn't expected her to name it directly instead of dancing around it with careful, overpolite questions the way most people did. Most people wait until dessert to ask. A faint smile tugged at his mouth. Not most people. And I'd rather know now if this is going to be weird for you, so I can stop worrying about saying the wrong thing. It's not going to be weird. He held her gaze steadily. Unless you make it weird by being careful with me, then I won't. She didn't. Not once through the appetizers, not through the wine she barely touched because she wanted to remember every word of this. He was sharp, sharper than the profile Renee had given her, funnier too, with a dry way of undercutting his own sentences right when they started sounding too serious. He asked about her work, really asked, followed up on details instead of nodding along. When the waiter came by and addressed his question to April instead of him, assuming, the way people do, Hanyi didn't flinch, didn't correct him. He just waited for April's reaction. She looked the waiter dead in the eye. You can talk to him. He's the one who ordered the wine you're about to bring. Waiter reddened and left. Hanyi watched her with something unreadable behind his eyes. You didn't have to do that. His voice dropped, quiet. I know. She held his gaze. I wanted to. If you're new here, welcome. Comment below and let us know where you're watching from tonight, then go ahead and hit like and subscribe. By the time they left the restaurant, something had already shifted that neither of them said out loud. He asked if she'd walk with him along the water instead of ending the night there, and she said yes before she'd finished thinking about it. 2 blocks in, his chair caught on a raised piece of sidewalk, and he stopped, not panicked, just stuck, jaw tightening slightly at being stopped like that in front of her. April didn't ask if he needed help. She just crouched, freed the wheel, and kept walking beside him like it had never happened. Not going to ask if I'm okay. His jaw was still tight, though his voice had eased. Are you? Yes. Then no. He looked at her for a long moment after that, like he was recalculating something. Like the numbers weren't adding up the way he'd expected them to. What April didn't know, what she had no way of knowing, was that 3 tables away that night, Renee had been watching the whole thing unfold from a seat near the bar, exactly like she'd arranged to. Renee wasn't there by accident. She told April she had a work dinner nearby, told herself she just wanted to make sure her friend was safe on a blind date with someone she barely knew. That was the story she told herself walking in. It wasn't the story she left with. She watched April laugh, really laugh, head tipped back. Easy, at something Hanyi said. She watched the moment with the waiter, watched April's spine straighten in a way Renee recognized from every time her friend had ever defended someone she cared about. She watched 2 people fall into each other in real time, over bread and wine, in under 90 minutes. And something in Renee's chest, quiet and unfamiliar, curled up tight and didn't let go. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself it a lot over the following weeks. The days after that first dinner didn't slow down the way first dates usually do. Hanyi texted the next morning. No games, no calculated waiting period. Just a simple line asking if she'd made it home safe. And then, 20 minutes later, a second message admitting he'd been staring at his phone since 6 a.m. waiting to send the first one. April read it twice before she answered. Their second date wasn't a date at all in the traditional sense. He asked her to meet him at a small gallery downtown, one she'd mentioned once, in passing, during a lull in their dinner conversation. A place she'd said she used to visit on her lunch breaks years ago before life got too busy for lunch breaks. She hadn't expected him to remember the name. She definitely hadn't expected him to have arranged a private viewing an hour before the gallery opened to the public, just so she could walk through it without the noise of other people. You remembered that. She stood in front of a painting she hadn't seen in years. I remember most things you say. He watched her take it in. It's a problem, honestly. I've stopped being able to focus on anything else. That sounds exhausting for you. April tilted her head. Remembering everything. You'd think so. He shrugged, easy. It's the first thing in years that hasn't felt like work. She laughed, but underneath the laugh, something in her chest had already started rearranging itself around him. The driver, a quiet man named Tobias, wheeled Hanyi through the gallery at a respectful distance, close enough to help if needed, far enough to give them privacy. April noticed, that day, the way Tobias watched Hanyi, not with the loose familiarity of an employee who'd been doing this job on autopilot for years, but with something closer to deference. She noticed it, filed it away without examining it, and let herself get lost in the paintings instead. By the third date, she'd stopped noticing the wheelchair at all in the way she had that first night. It had simply become part of him, unremarkable, the way anyone's body is unremarkable once you know the person inside it. What she noticed instead were smaller things. The way he tilted his head slightly when he was actually listening versus performing listening. The low laugh he tried to suppress and never quite managed. The careful, deliberate way he chose his words like a man used to being quoted. That third date was the one where a stranger tried to make Hanyi small in front of her, and April found out exactly how far she was willing to go before she'd even had time to think about it. They were at a restaurant on the Upper East Side, a place with white tablecloths and low conversation, the kind of room where nobody expected to be watched and everybody was anyway. A woman at the next table, mid-40s, dressed for a different kind of evening than the one she was actually having, leaned toward her companion not quite quietly enough. It's sweet, I guess. Some women really do it out of pity. April heard every word. So did Hanyi. Neither of them reacted right away. You don't have to say anything. Hanyi kept his eyes on his plate, voice low. I've heard worse. I know I don't have to. April didn't look away from him. She set down her fork, turned in her chair, and looked directly at the woman until the woman had no choice but to look back. I'm sorry, were you talking about us? April asked, voice pleasant, almost sweet, which somehow made it worse for the woman on the receiving end. I didn't mean anything by it. The woman flushed, flustered. You did. April's tone stayed even. You just didn't expect either of us to hear you clearly enough to say something back. Woman had no response. Her companion suddenly found something urgent to say about the wine list. April turned back around, picked her fork back up, and continued eating like nothing had happened at all. Hanyi watched her for a long moment. You didn't have to do that either. A small, genuine smile broke through. I know. April smiled back. I'm starting to notice I keep saying that to you. I'm starting to notice I like hearing it. That was the night, if she was being honest with herself later, that April understood this wasn't a fling she could quietly end if things got complicated. Somewhere between the appetizer and the woman at the next table, she'd already decided he was worth defending. She just hadn't said it out loud yet, to him or to herself. Renee heard about each date in pieces, delivered over wine, over brunch, over late-night phone calls when April couldn't sleep from the sheer unfamiliar feeling of being happy. April told her everything, not because she needed permission, but because Renee had always been the person she told everything to. The person who'd celebrated every good thing in her life since college without a single visible crack. The cracks were there. April just didn't know to look for them yet. Renee started small. A comment about how fast things were moving. A raised eyebrow when April mentioned Hanyi had already met her mother over video call. A joke, light, almost affectionate on the surface, about April playing nurse, for a man who could clearly afford actual nurses if he needed the help she was so eager to give. April laughed it off each time. That was Renee, she told herself. Protective, a little blunt. It didn't occur to her that protection and resentment can wear nearly identical faces from a distance. A month in, Hanyi took her to Chicago for the first time. Officially, he said, for business, though the itinerary he handed her had more restaurants marked on it than meetings. She teased him about it the entire flight, and he let her, smiling the small, private smile she'd started to recognize as the one he wore when he was hiding how much effort had actually gone into something he wanted to seem effortless. It was on that trip she first felt the ground shift slightly beneath her feet, though she wouldn't understand why until much later. They were having a late dinner in a private room at the back of a restaurant that didn't have a sign out front, and a man in an expensive suit approached their table, said something quiet to Han-Yi in a tone that didn't sound like small talk, and left without ever once looking at April. Business. Han-Yi's answer came easily when she asked, "You said this was a business trip." "It is." Something flat in his tone made her decide, for reasons she couldn't fully articulate, not to push further that night. She thought about it on the flight home, staring out the window at the clouds, turning the moment over without quite knowing what she was looking for. She didn't mention it to Renee. She barely mentioned it to herself. Back in Manhattan, the relationship deepened fast. Han-Yi remembered which coffee order was hers and which was for her assistant. He learned the doorman's name and asked after his knee surgery every time he came by. He sat through an entire dinner with her mother without once making it about himself. Better at this than most men who have had legs their whole lives. Her mother said it without unkindness, and April laughed so hard she nearly choked on her wine. But under the good nights, small inconsistencies kept surfacing. A phone call he stepped out to take, voice dropped into a register she'd never heard him use with her. A driver who flinched at a raised eyebrow. A restaurant that cleared entire sections the moment he arrived, staff moving less like good service and more like fear. She noticed these things the way you notice a loose thread on a sweater you love too much to examine. She kept wearing the sweater until an ordinary Tuesday when his phone lit up on the table between them and a title, not a name, flashed across the screen, attached to a company she'd never heard him mention. He silenced it without looking and kept talking. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Just work." He set the phone face down. "Nothing that can't wait." She let it go. She thought about that screen for 3 days afterward anyway. Renee, meanwhile, had stopped being subtle even with herself about what she was feeling. She started asking around, casually, she told herself, and a mutual acquaintance mentioned the name. Han-Yi rang a bell from Chicago, something involving boardrooms and men who stepped down from powerful positions a little too quietly right before he arrived. She didn't tell April. She told herself she was protecting her. The truth was simpler. She wanted to know more about the man who'd made her best friend glow like that before she decided how to feel about it. She started showing up more, inviting herself to dinners under the cover of missing her friend, studying Han-Yi with questions that had shifted from curiosity to audit. What does he do exactly? Who are these people calling him? Does he ever talk about his family? Your friend asks a lot of questions for someone who claims not to care about the answers. Han-Yi said it once they were alone, watching her face for a reaction. She's protective. April didn't look up. She's always been protective. There's a difference between protective and hungry. His voice stayed level. I've spent a long time learning to tell them apart. April didn't argue with him exactly, but she didn't fully hear him either. It would take Chicago and everything after it for those words to land the way they were meant to. One night, 4 dates in, April came back from dinner with Han-Yi and found Renee waiting up for her, a bottle already half empty on the counter. "You look happy." Something underneath Renee's words went unnoticed by April entirely. "I'm happy." April dropped onto the stool beside her, still warm from the night. "Ren, I know this sounds insane this fast, but I think this might be it." Renee's smile didn't move, but something behind her eyes did. "That's amazing." April didn't catch it. She was too busy being in love to notice her best friend's voice had gone slightly hollow around the edges. The dinner in Chicago that finally broke everything open happened on April, and Han-Yi's 4th trip there together. In a private dining room she'd been in once before, with 2 men she'd never met joining them at Han-Yi's request. He'd told her beforehand it would be a quick, informal thing, dinner with people who mattered to a deal he was closing. She'd worn the green dress he liked and thought nothing more of it. The energy at the table was different from the moment they sat down, stiffer, more careful. The kind of tension that exists in rooms where everyone present understands a hierarchy that hasn't been spoken aloud. One of the men, older, silver-haired, made a comment about how convenient it must be for Han-Yi to let people believe he was harmless, that it certainly made negotiations easier when the other side walked in already underestimating him. April felt her stomach drop before her mind had fully caught up to why. "What does that mean?" she asked, looking at Han Yi, who had gone very still in his chair. He didn't answer right away. In the silence, the second man, younger, clearly newer to whatever room this was, misreading the moment as an opportunity to bond rather than a landmine, laughed. "Wait, you really didn't tell her?" Han Yi's jaw tightened. He set his glass down on the table with a precision that felt louder than if he'd slammed it. Then, slowly, deliberately, he stood. He stood fully, steadily, unassisted. Out of the wheelchair he had used every single day since the moment April had first laid eyes on him. And the entire table went silent except for the sound of April's own breath, catching somewhere high in her throat. 2 waiters near the kitchen door stopped mid-step. A manager who'd been circling the room for 20 minutes suddenly found somewhere else to be. Even the older man who'd started this, the one with the silver hair, sat back slightly in his chair, recalculating something in real time. Need 5 minutes. Han Yi's voice was low and controlled, a register April had never once heard directed at her. Alone, with her. They left without a word of protest. Nobody in that room argued with him. April understood, in that single detail alone, more about the last 4 months of her life than she wanted to. If your heart is already pounding, this is the moment to hit like and drop a comment telling us what you think April does next, and subscribe now, because what happens between them after this is even harder to watch. Going to want an explanation. Han Yi waited until they were alone. And you're right to want one. You're going to want to make it very good. April's voice was steadier than she felt, he told her. All of it, the wheelchair, the test he'd built for himself, the years of watching every woman who came near him recalibrate the second they learned what he actually controlled. Boardrooms, empires. Men who feared his name in rooms April had never been allowed to imagine existed. He spoke slowly, evenly, like a man reciting something he'd rehearsed alone in the dark more than once. He told her he'd needed to know once completely whether someone could choose him with nothing to gain from the choice. And I did. April's voice was quiet. I chose you when I thought there was nothing to choose. You did. I the first. You're the only one who never once treated me like something broken. His eyes held hers. Everyone else before the money, the first thing they did was pity me or manage me. You just corrected a waiter and kept eating your appetizer. April sat with that for a long moment, feeling the entire shape of her last 4 months rearrange itself in her head without breaking. I need a minute. She finally spoke. Not because of what you have, because you let me love someone I didn't fully know. You knew all of him that mattered. Han Yi's voice didn't waver. The rest was just furniture. She almost laughed despite herself. Almost. I ask you something. April held his eyes. And you actually answer it instead of giving me the version you've clearly given other people before. Yes. The wheelchair, not the test. I understand the test. Why that specifically? You could have hidden money instead, pretended to be broke. Anyone would run the test that way. Han Yi was quiet for a moment, longer than any silence he'd let sit between them before. Because money is something people forgive quickly if they think there's a chance of getting some later. He chose each word deliberately. A wheelchair isn't. Nobody stays for the chance of a payout from a man they think can't move without help. If someone stayed for that, I'd know it was real, because there'd be no reasonable story where staying benefited them. That's a very calculated thing to build your entire love life around. I didn't build it because I wanted to be calculated. His voice dropped, quieter now. I built it because I watched my own mother stay with a man for 11 years after he lost everything, and then leave the day he got it back, because staying had stopped being about him and started being about waiting. I didn't want to spend my life wondering which version of me someone was actually waiting for. April didn't say anything right away. She just reached over and put her hand over his, on the table, in front of 2 empty chairs where powerful men had been sitting minutes earlier. I wasn't waiting for anything. She kept her hand where it was. I didn't even know there was something to wait for. I know. Han Yi's hand turned beneath hers. That's the only reason I'm telling you any of this instead of watching you decide whether to leave. I'm not deciding whether to leave. April's tone was even. I'm deciding how angry I'm allowed to be while I stay. That seems fair. His shoulders eased just slightly. Take whatever time you need with that. I'm not going anywhere. How long? She studied his face. Were you going to let this go on before you told me? I didn't have a number in mind. He held her gaze, unflinching. I only knew I wasn't going to tell you until I was certain you weren't going to leave the second you learned the truth. Tonight wasn't my choice. It was his. He nodded toward the door the men had gone through. I would have told you myself, eventually, on my own terms. That's not much better. April didn't soften. No, he didn't argue the point. It isn't, I know that. She appreciated, despite everything, that he didn't try to argue his way out of it. They didn't resolve it all that night. But she didn't leave either, and when she called Renee the next morning, still stunned, still turning the truth over in her hands, she didn't expect what came next. Renee already knew, not everything, but enough. She'd done more digging in the weeks prior than April had realized, and when April told her the truth with her voice still shaking, Renee's reaction didn't match what a best friend's reaction should have been. There was a pause on the line, too long. So it's true. Renee's voice came carefully. He's that Han-Yi. You knew. April's words slowed. Didn't you? You already knew or suspected, and you didn't say anything. I wasn't sure. The reply came too quickly. April said nothing for a moment, the silence stretching long enough that Renee felt compelled to fill it. Just think it's a lot, Ape. A man like that, you didn't sign up for that world. I'm worried about you. You worried about me? April's voice slowed further. Or are you upset it's not you? The silence that followed answered the question louder than words could have. Over the next weeks, Renee stopped hiding it. It came out in pieces, a comment here, a too familiar text to Han-Yi there. A night Renee showed up somewhere she'd clearly known Han-Yi would be, dressed like she was auditioning for a role that had never been offered to her. She told herself it wasn't betrayal. She told herself April had gotten lucky, not chosen, that anyone would have loved him once they knew what he was worth, and that she, Renee, would have loved him regardless, the same as April if only she'd been given the chance first. In the weeks after the truth came out, April went quiet in a way that worried people who knew her well. She kept working, kept showing up to the places she was expected to show up to, kept answering texts within a reasonable amount of time. But there was a stretch of about 10 days where she didn't call Renee at all, didn't reach out first, didn't do the thing she'd always done in the past, where she smoothed over tension before it had the chance to become something real. She spent some of those evenings alone at her apartment, turning the last 4 months over in her mind, trying to figure out which parts of her memory needed to be recolored now that she knew what she knew. The gallery visit, the rooftop dinner, the weekend upstate. None of it felt fake, exactly. Han-Yi's attention had always been specific, deliberate, aimed at her and nobody else. But she found herself wondering, some nights, what it must have felt like from his side, watching every person who came near him and running the same silent calculation about whether they'd stay. A coworker asked her twice that week if everything was all right. She'd missed a deadline she never missed, said sorry, what? In a meeting for the second time in a day, she said she was fine. She wasn't lying exactly. She just hadn't finished deciding yet. Did you ever think I might be like the others? She asked him once, during that stretch sitting across from him at his apartment instead of a restaurant, no audience, no performance required. Every day for the first month, he admitted. Not because of anything you did, because it's what the test trained me to expect. I kept waiting for the moment you'd start asking questions that weren't really about me. And when I didn't, I started being afraid of something else. His voice quieted. That I'd waited so long to trust it that I might ruin it out of habit before I let myself actually have it. April didn't have a clean response to that. She just reached over and laced her fingers through his, and they sat in the kind of silence that didn't need filling. Renee, meanwhile, wasn't sitting still. Whatever quiet reckoning was happening on April's side of things, Renee had decided, somewhere in that same stretch of days, that the only way forward was to act before the door closed on her entirely. She told herself she wasn't trying to take anything from April. She was simply, finally, being honest about feelings she'd buried for the sake of a friendship that had already, in her telling of it, run its course the moment April found someone who actually saw her. She said exactly that to Han-Yi, eventually, cornering a moment alone with him at an event April had stepped away from briefly. I want you to know. Renee's voice came soft, rehearsed. I would have chosen you too. Even before, I'm not like the others. Han-Yi looked at her for a long moment, not angry, not even particularly surprised. Just quiet, the way a man looks at a hand he's already seen every card in. You had 4 months to choose me. His tone didn't shift. You spent them resenting the person who did. Renee's smile faltered. I already ran this test. He held her gaze without warmth. I know exactly what it looks like when someone means it. You've just shown me what it looks like when someone doesn't. She tried to recover, tried to laugh it off as a joke gone too far, but something in his face told her the conversation was already over, had been over before she opened her mouth. April found out about the cornered conversation within days. Han-Yi told her himself, without flinching, Because whatever else was true about him, he'd never once lied to her since the truth had come out. And something in April went cold and clear all at once, hearing it. Not surprised, just finally fully certain. She confronted Renee directly in Renee's own apartment, no audience, no performance. Renee opened the door already looking like she knew what this was. For months, April didn't step further inside. For months you watched me fall in love, and the entire time you were waiting for a reason to want him too. That's not fair. Renee's arms tightened across her chest. Don't. April's voice stayed level. I watched you smile at me every single time I told you something good happening in my life. I trusted that smile. You didn't want him when you thought he was just a man in a wheelchair. You wanted him the second you found out what he controlled. You have no idea what it's like watching you get everything I've been trying to build for years just fall into your lap because you happened to walk into the right restaurant on the right night. For a moment, something honest slipped through the practiced hurt in Renee's voice. It didn't fall into my lap. April held her ground. I chose him when there was nothing in it for me. You've spent this entire conversation talking about what he has. Not once have you said his name like a person. Opened her mouth, then closed it again. 10 years. April's voice dropped, quieter now. 10 years I told you every good thing that happened to me first. I don't know anymore how many of those years you were actually happy for me, and how many you were just waiting for something to go wrong so you'd feel better about your own life. That's the part that actually hurts. Not that you wanted him. That I can't tell anymore which parts of the last 10 years were real. Didn't have an answer for that. There wasn't one. She left April's apartment a few minutes later, and neither of them said goodbye in the way they always used to, out of habit, without thinking. What came after wasn't loud. Han-Yi didn't threaten Renee, didn't have her followed, didn't do a single thing that could be called revenge in any obvious sense, which was, in its own way, more unsettling than if he had. The party where it finally happened was one April almost didn't attend. It was a fundraiser, the kind of event Han-Yi's world required a handful of times a year, held in a hotel ballroom with a guest list long enough that April recognized maybe a third of the names on it. Renee wasn't invited, not officially, but she'd found her way onto the list anyway, through a mutual connection who didn't know any better, wearing a dress April recognized because she'd been the one to help Renee pick it out once, back when they still did things like that together. April saw her first, across the room, and felt something in her chest go still and cold. She's here. April kept her voice low, close to Han-Yi. I know. He didn't look surprised. I've known since she confirmed the RSVP under someone else's name 3 days ago. You let her come. I let her think she got away with something. His tone stayed even. It matters for what happens tonight that she believes she chose to be here, not that I let her. April didn't fully understand what he meant until an hour later, when she watched a small cluster of Renee's oldest friends. Women April also knew. Women who'd known Renee since business school. Women whose good opinion Renee had spent a decade curating like a garden, pull away from her in the middle of a conversation. Expressions shifting from polite to distant in the space of a few sentences. April couldn't hear what was said. She didn't need to. She recognized the shape of the moment from the outside, the particular way a room recalibrates around someone once a piece of information lands that can't be unlanded. She found out later, from someone who'd been standing close enough to hear, what had actually happened. Nothing dramatic. Nobody had accused Renee of anything to her face. Someone had simply mentioned, in the context of an entirely unrelated conversation about loyalty and old friendships, a pattern, the way Renee had disappeared from April's life for an entire year once when April had booked her first big client, and Renee hadn't yet found her own footing. The way she'd resurfaced the moment April's fortunes dipped again. The timing of her sudden, renewed interest in April's love life, the moment it became clear who Han-Yi actually was. None of it, said on its own, was a crime. Together, delivered by someone with no obvious motive to lie, it painted a picture too clear to argue with. Han-Yi hadn't said a single word to anyone that night. He hadn't needed to. He'd simply made sure the people who already half suspected the pattern had the missing pieces to complete it, delivered by voices that weren't his, in a room where he never once had to raise his own. April watched Renee's face change across the room. Confusion, then a slow dawning horror as she understood what was happening to her, in real time, without anyone ever saying her name loudly enough for her to properly object. By the time April crossed the room to find her, Renee was standing alone near the bar. The crowd around her thinned out in a way that felt less like an accident and more like weather. You did this. Renee's voice cracked slightly when she saw April approaching, more exposed than April had heard it in years. He didn't say a single untrue thing about you. April didn't blink. That's the part you should sit with. I made mistakes, I know I did. But this, Renee gestured at the room, at the backs turned toward her. This is cruel. April's voice stayed even. Cruel would have been making something up. This is just what happens when the truth finally gets to talk without you managing the room first. Didn't have an answer for that. She left before dessert was served, and April didn't go after her. The withdrawal happened exactly the way it always does, quietly, socially, without a single dramatic scene. Invitations that stopped including her. Conversations that grew shorter. A silence in every room she walked into that she couldn't name but could absolutely feel. People she'd known for years suddenly had other plans, other commitments, other reasons not to be wherever she was. Within weeks, the version of Renee's life she'd built her entire identity around simply wasn't there to walk back into. She called April once, near the end of it, voice raw in a way April had never heard from her before. I know I don't deserve you to pick up. Renee's voice was raw. I need you to know I understand now. What I did, what it cost. April listened. She didn't forgive her, not that night, maybe not ever completely, but she didn't hang up either. I hope you figure out how to be someone people can trust again. April kept her voice quiet. I really do, just not with me, not right now. Do you think there'll ever be a version of this where we're okay again? For once, Renee didn't sound like she was performing the question for anyone's benefit but her own. April thought about it honestly before she answered, because Renee, for all her faults, at least deserved that much. I don't know. She let the silence sit before continuing. I think there might be a version of us that speaks again someday. I don't think there's a version where I forget what the 10 days after Chicago felt like. You don't get to keep the friendship and skip the part where you have to sit with what you did to earn losing it. That's fair. Renee's voice had gone quiet. I know. April's tone softened just slightly. That's the only reason I answered. She ended the call and sat with the quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that comes after something finally, fully closes. Hanyi found her like that later that night, still sitting by the window, and didn't ask what was wrong. He just sat beside her, close, present, the way he'd been every day since the truth came out, nothing left between them anymore that either of them was hiding. Regret looks different on people who deserved better than they gave. His voice was quiet. Is that supposed to make me feel better? No, he shook his head slightly. It's supposed to remind you that you never had to become her to survive loving me. You just had to be exactly who you already were. That almost sounds like something you rehearsed. A small, tired smile finally broke through. Had 4 months to think about how I'd say it, he admitted. I just didn't expect to need it this soon. April leaned her head against his shoulder, and for the first time since the truth had unraveled everything she thought she understood, the silence between them didn't feel like something waiting to break. It felt like something that had already been tested and had held. If this story has stayed with you this long, let us know in the comments what part hit you hardest. Hit that like button. And subscribe so you're here for the next one, because there's always another test coming. Months later, when people asked April how she knew, so early, that Hanyi was the one before the money, before the empire, before any of it, she never mentioned the wheelchair or the reveal or the danger that came with loving a man like that. She talked about the waiter. It's never the big thing, she'd tell them. It's whether someone corrects a waiter for you when there's nothing in it for them. That, she'd learned, was the only test that ever mattered. And it was the only one Renee had failed. 6 months after that night in Chicago, April stood in the same gallery Hanyi had rented out for her on their second date. Except this time the room was full, actual gallery hours, actual crowds. An exhibit she'd helped curate herself after Hanyi quietly funded a program for young black artists in the city, careful never to put his name anywhere near the credit for it. She found him near the entrance, out of the wheelchair now permanently, standing the way he'd stood that first night in Chicago, except there was nothing left between them anymore for either of them to hide. He looked, she thought, exactly like a man who had finally stopped waiting to be tested. Starring. He caught her eye as she reached him. I'm allowed to stare at my own boyfriend. You've been starring for 4 minutes. A slow grin spread. I counted. You would. Fiancé, he corrected quietly, like it still surprised him to say it out loud. Yet, she smiled. Ask me properly first. I'm working up to it. Your time. April's eyes stayed on his. I already know the answer. You always do. He shook his head, amused. It's slightly unfair to the rest of us who have to think things through. Some of us just choose faster. April's smile widened. It's a skill. You could learn it if you stopped overthinking every single decision like it needed a boardroom vote first. Later that night, walking home along the same stretch of water where his chair had once caught on an uneven piece of sidewalk, April thought about Renee for the first time in weeks. She'd heard, through someone else, that Renee had moved to another city, started over somewhere nobody knew the story. The way people sometimes did when a version of their life became too heavy to keep living in the same rooms where everyone had watched it happen. April didn't feel triumphant about it. She didn't feel much of anything, honestly, except a kind of quiet, settled peace at having finally stopped waiting for an apology that would have meant something only if it had come before the exposure, not after. Thinking about her, Hanyi's voice was close beside her. Do you always know? Had a lot of practice paying attention to you. He kept his eyes on the water. It used to be a survival skill. Now it's just something I like doing. That's the most romantic thing you've said all week, and it was about a survival skill. You get quiet in a specific way. He glanced at her. It's different from your normal quiet. I have a normal quiet. You have several. A small smile crossed his face. I've been taking notes. April laughed, and the sound of it carried out over the water, easy and unguarded. The same laugh he'd fallen for at a restaurant table months earlier when she'd looked at him and decided, without knowing anything about what he controlled or commanded, that he was worth choosing anyway. That, in the end, was the whole story. Not the empire. Not the reveal. Just two people who had chosen each other before there was anything to gain, and kept choosing each other after there was everything to lose. Hanyi says the moment that mattered wasn't the restaurant or the wheelchair. It was 2 blocks later, when the chair caught on the sidewalk, and she fixed it without asking if he was okay, like his dignity had never once been in question. That's when he stopped running the test in his head. April still corrects waiters who assume the wrong things about the people she loves. Some habits are worth keeping long after the reason for them has changed. And somewhere in Manhattan, most evenings, you might still catch the two of them walking that same stretch of water. No wheelchair, no audience, no test left to run. Just two people still choosing each other, the same way every day since.